Thank you. So, what this session is about is really a reflection on something that's very familiar. I mean, when you say you're a professor of tourism, people think it's slightly amusing that you need a professor of tourism, because everybody feels a little bit like an expert. If you're fortunate enough and you've been able to travel, then everyone has an opinion and knows something about travel and tourism. So what we're going to be looking at and thinking about is something that's familiar to you, either in your work or certainly as a tourist. So I'm going to start with a very quick quiz just to see what you know. Then I'll say something about how we define the tourism industry, a little bit about tourism growth and what's really, so that you get an understanding of the magnitude of the industry and how quickly it's growing. Then I'll say something about the importance of tourism, and this is really just focus on the economic side and also in relation to jobs. Drivers of tourism growth. Why, as people concerned with disaster management, you should be concerned with some of the things that are happening in tourism, so some of those drivers of risk. And then I'll say a little bit about the UNWTO. Okay, so that's the plan. As I say, whistle-stop tour. Let's start off with a very quick true or false. Much of the world's tourism is international. False. So 80% of tourism is domestic trips. And we also think of tourism as being a huge international industry, which it is. 80% of that activity is actually domestic. Okay. International tourist arrivals exceeded 1 billion for the first time in 2012.
True.
Hey!
My work here is finished.
True. For the first, yes, it did, up from 995 million. So, yeah, I mean, the key point, it's a lot of people. Most tourism journeys by air.
Not 80% of tourist trips are domestic.
Perfect. Most tourism journeys are by car. Nice. Because air transport is what we think of when we think of tourism, for obvious reasons. Europe receives the largest market share of international tourism. No, you're not convinced by that at all, are you? It's actually true. So Europe as the continent just still gets the majority of tourism international receipts. So the majority of visitors, the majority of money is in Europe, which is really quite surprising. Again, it's because we tend to hear about other areas of the world and it's almost taken for granted in Europe. Okay, two more. It wasn't only about leisure holidays. No. Yes. Very clear on that, absolutely. Business, conferences, education, a whole range of things that we'll come on to look at. But yes, it's commonly people think it's just about going on holiday for the nice reasons. Travel for holiday and leisure in 2012 accounted for the majority of tourist arrivals.
True.
Yes.
Ooh,
it's just still the majority of travel for leisure, but that gives you an indication of how important the business and all the other stuff is as well. How about that one? Small and medium businesses dominate tourism. True. The vast majority of tourism businesses are SMEs. So it's that family business, maybe employing 2 or 3 people, form by far the majority of tourism businesses. And this is contrary to what we think, because we always imagine tourism as the big players, and they're the ones that are most visible to us. But as an industry, it's extremely fragmented. And of course, I imagine important to what you've already heard this morning, the coordination amongst those SMEs is really, really challenging. So thank you, fabulous. I think you got at least half right. So definition of tourism, there is one, and this has been the definition of tourism since 1994. It hasn't changed, and it is the activities of persons travelling to and staying in places outside their usual environment for not more than 1 consecutive year for leisure, businesses and other purposes. Quite a mouthful. The key points from that is tourism involves movement, you've got to go somewhere. Tourism involves staying somewhere, and it's counted if you stay more than 1 night, you are a tourist. You can't stay for more than a year. You count as a temporary migrant on a country's tourism statistics if you're away for more than 365 days. So in terms of how we count tourists, how does a country know how many people are in it at any one point of time, this is the definition they would use. Now, definitions are notoriously unreliable, and the only one that destinations and countries use all agree to use is that UNWTO definition. So if you're looking at a sort of global definition, the UNWTO is the one to use, but people do count things differently. With tourism, there's a demand and a supply side. So commonly when we think about tourism definitions, they refer to the tourism demand. So they refer to the people rather than the physical infrastructure that we have as part of tourism. So if we look at the demand side, tourism is often looked at by purpose of visit, length of stay, residence, distance, and that's what we agreed, how you measure the people who are part of that tourism infrastructure. Interestingly, the distance, 160 kilometres away from home, is the minimum you have to be considered a tourist, which of course is very old-fashioned, slightly bizarre, but it's the one that's still used. I don't expect you to memorise this at all, but it's just to give you an indication of the complexity of classifying tourists. Now, this comes from the UNWTO website, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I've put it up there really to give you an indication of the variety of activities that surround tourism demand. So what you've got here, anyone travelling, and included in tourism statistics, visitors, and they can be same-day visitors, they can be tourists, i.e. they're staying away from home for more than one night, often categorised by purpose of visit. The detail isn't particularly important for your purposes, only that there are a whole bunch of people who are not ever counted in tourism statistics. So when you see a figure for how many tourists a country gets, it's not including all of these people that are also mobile or permanently, or semi-registered within a destination. So if there's a problem with tourism, and you've got big numbers of tourists, there's all of these people who fall off the radar in terms of being counted as tourism statistics. I don't suggest you bother to memorise or read about any of that, just to say it's quite complex and treat tourism statistics with caution, because they're absolutely not perfect for all sorts of reasons. That's the demand side. Definitions also talk about the supply side, and that is the physical infrastructure or the goods and services that are produced through tourism. Don't need to go into a lot of detail other than to say that you can measure the economic value of tourism by looking at the flows of goods through the economy, or you can try and measure the physical infrastructure that is tourism. And I've got a handout I'll leave you with that the WTO include in their standard industrial classification of tourist activities. And it's everything, it's the obvious, hotels, airlines, restaurants, and it goes all the way down to the kind of more tenuous links, i.e. the construction industry, who might be building those hotels. The point to make here is, again, treat statistics with caution, because it's in the interest of the tourism industry to say, do you know what, everything's about tourism. So that's what they do, they big it up. You know, yes, a hotel is, but what about the people that bake the bread for it? What about the people that built it? What about the people that supply the water to it? So that supply chain is enormous, and it does the industry, it serves it well to say we are a big, important industry. So treat definitions with some degree of caution. Oh, I don't know why the ends of the words are falling off my falling off my slides. Unexplained.
We're losing a bit of our attraction.
Yes. The tourism industry, in a nutshell, consists of these things. So, food and drink sector, transport, accommodation, travel agencies, tour operators. Essentially, if you were tourism students, you'd talk about these as intermediaries. So these are the people that bring the supply and the demand together. But all you need to know is, essentially when we talk about the tourism industry, the big players, accommodation, transport and attraction. And then the food and drink sector commonly gets talked about in relation to the hospitality industry. Now, there's always rivalry between tourism and hospitality. Tourism people say hospitality is a part of tourism. Hospitality people say it's completely separate and it's much more important. So it depends on your view, where you sit. I'm a tourism professor, I actually don't mind. To me, hospitality is absolutely an integral part of people moving around, needing somewhere to stay, needing somewhere to eat. So I don't necessarily see the distinction. But if you're thinking about in relation to you and your disaster management, you know, there will be there'll be areas where the sectors don't necessarily meet, and don't assume the two different sectors talk to each other. don't assume that the tourism sector will know anything about or understand the hospitality sector, because in terms of governments and in terms of how they're organised, they're often separate. Because if I think of the UK, who's responsible for tourism is not the same as who's responsible for hospitality. So it's a little bit odd, and it's historical really as to how we've ended up in this situation. Just the structure of the industry, and I put this slide up only so that you see how big it is, because I think when we talk about hospitality, we just think of the hotels and restaurants. That's the most obvious thing. But if you think about the broad scope of the hospitality industry, you get an understanding of how large it is. And of course, hospitality, I think, on the far side is the one that people rarely remember, that the hospitality industry serves workplaces, education, prisons, shops. So it's not just about tourism. So again, a really large industry. So if you are responsible for coordinating this from a tourism disaster management perspective, the message is it's big, it's messy, and it's complicated. You probably knew that. I'm sure Richard's already said that another time. Events industry I won't dwell on, other than to say that it's seen usually entirely separately from tourism, although obviously it's part of the visitor economy, so it's slightly nonsensical to not see that the two are aligned. I know you've got some dedicated sessions on each of these sectors, so I won't dwell on it. But events are everything from a local community event right up to a mega event, and the most obvious one being the Olympics. It's actually quite hard to categorise events. These boundaries are not necessarily clear-cut. Sometimes easier to think of events not in terms of size, but in their type or the purpose of them. A lot of events, of course, are temporary or one-off. Might make a huge difference to the number of people in a place at a particular time. If you go to Glastonbury any other time, you'll be on your own. If you go when the music festival's on, you'll be there with a few thousand people, hundreds of thousands of people. Yeah, so they are, from a sort of disaster management perspective, it's important to know the extra pressure that's on the infrastructure when some of these big events are in town. But that's all I'd say on there. Types of tourism. Well, you can pretty much call any activity of people going away and staying, so long as they're away for one night, you can pretty much call them tourists. So what are some of the more familiar ones? And some of those might be familiar to you, others less so.
Yeah, disaster tourism is on there.
Disaster tourism is on there, and disaster tourism is a growth area. So if you're a tour operator and you're thinking where to put your money next, disaster tourism is one of them.
What's extreme tourism?
Doing dangerous things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like jumping off, like tombstoning off rocks, and dreadfully dangerous things.
Or like wine tourism.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
That's a particularly innovative, brilliant idea, and hugely popular. And another one, I guess, is dark tourism. Is visiting sites that are, for whatever reason, challenging. It might be war graves, or it might be visiting the remains of the Twin Towers. So it's something that is people go to see sometimes out of morbid curiosity or other reasons, and it follows any disaster that's taken place. So very strange phenomena. Again, just so that you've got an understanding or some idea of the very different ways in which tourism is marketed. It can pretty much be put together any way you want to. Now, if we're going to be a bit more academic about it, I did feel obliged to introduce you to LIPA's model of the tourism system. This is an old model. It's been around since the early 1970s. It's quite simple. It's actually one of the easiest ones to remember in terms of thinking about those activities that all constitute tourism. And effectively all it's saying is this is where your demand is, the travel generating region. So this is your people that for whatever reason are travelling. They're heading to the tourism destination. The bit in the middle is the tourism transit routes. So you've got people going and people coming back. And effectively, that's the system that operates 365 days a year constantly. So that tourism system is really encouraging us to think about movement and the continuous nature of people going from one place to another. It's oversimplified, obviously. You might be going to several places. But if you think about the likelihood of where perhaps disasters might be most common, we're really thinking about the transit routes and, of course, in the destination as well. So if you are required at any point in any of your assignments to talk about the tourism system, I'd use LEAP-UP. He's the one that's quite simple. It's old, but it still has relevance. Okay, so you know tourism's big. That's the point. Big, fragmented, not always easy to coordinate. Tourism growth. Do we think tourism's growing as an industry?
Yeah.
Thought so, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and it's actually one of the few success stories. If you looked at an industry over the last 50 years, tourism has grown year on year, almost without exception. I think the last time tourism growth slowed was 2009, the economic depression of 2009. And I say it slowed, it still grew. On average, tourism grows about 3% a year. So as an industry, that's quite a lot. On a good year, it might be 5%, and even on a poor year, it's 1 or 2. So if you want an example of a successful industry that seems to ride out the storm, whatever that is, tourism is a good example of that. Just to give you an indication, 1950, 25 million tourist arrivals. Receipts are always in US dollars, measured by UNWTO. Up to last year, that's the last year we've got complete figures for us, at 1,326,000,000 tourist arrivals. So early stages of tourism growth really took off in the 1970s. You may be not old enough to remember the emerging seeds of mass tourism, but that's really when we started talking about huge increases in the number of people being able to travel, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. So tourism growth, I guess the point to make is it's a reliable industry to invest in. And so despite some of the challenges and the problems, people always come back to tourism as a mechanism for growth. Now this slide is a little bit hard to see, but what I've put on there is it shows you where the arrivals and receipts are by continent. And so what I come back to saying again is it's still Europe where the majority of tourism happens, which is really interesting because we always think it's in the Far East or we think it's perhaps over in the Americas, and actually Europe still dominates in terms of tourism arrivals and receipts. So that's UNWTO figures that give you some indication as to where those tourists are heading. Biggest growth region, where might that be? Who's growing faster than anybody else as a region for tourism?
Asia Pacific?
Perfect. Yes, it's Asia, and it's fueled by the growth in the Chinese market. So where's the next big generator of tourism demand? Everybody's looking at China because of middle incomes, a middle class that's growing. This slide is actually against prediction, and it's really just to show that tourism is actually exceeding its forecasts. So a lot of people who enjoy numbers, I don't particularly spend a lot of time trying to make economic predictions about tourism, and they tend to underestimate it, which is interesting because most industries overestimate it. But there we're looking at prediction of 1.8 billion people travelling by 2030. So that's significant, that's another 500 million people. So the last time we went on holiday, if you thought it was overcrowded now, you just wait. And there's a lot of talk in the press, there's a lot of talk around issues to do with over-tourism as the popular term is being used. So the industry really has got a problem of curbing growth rather than encouraging it. Top 10 destinations. Any idea who gets the most tourists as a country? Any idea which country receives the most tourists? Now, I'll give you a clue, it's in Europe. No reason why you would know. I just wondered if anybody did.
Spain.
Well, you're close. It's actually France. So France is the country in the globe that gets the biggest share of tourism arrivals. 86 million people in 2017. Now, if I put the others up there, you'll see, I've got the 10. You'll see that France, Spain, Italy, UK are still in there. UK's always around about 4th or 5th or 6th, doesn't tend to change much. UK gets roughly 35 million visitors a year, and it's sometimes higher up in the league depending on how others have done. There's an anomaly in there, which is Mexico. because everyone says, why doesn't Mexico, a good place, but why does it get so many tourists? And that's cross-border travel between Mexico and the United States. So anyone travelling between the two, if they stay a night, basically count on the tourism statistics, and even though, because they're probably going shopping, not actually staying as tourists. And France is always consistently high because of where it is, so people pass through France to go to those other European destinations as well. So the point, I guess, is if you're looking at understanding who receives the most tourists, always read the small print. What are they actually measuring? Because there are some things on there that make you think, that's not quite right. Thailand, for example, gets very little traffic other than people actually going on holiday. So that's a fairly accurate figure. UK government tends to think 35 million is not really worth worrying about. We have a very a weird relationship in the UK with the tourism industry. We take it for granted because we don't have to try very hard. Because people at some point in their lives want to visit London. So that's why we do quite well. Okay, so that's to give you an idea of the magnitude and an idea of where tourism is happening. Why do we care? The organisation that gives a lot of facts and figures and statistics in relation to the industry is the World Travel and Tourism Council, and that's really why I've put this slide up here. But tourism is more than you imagine. So they talked on this slide, they talk about cultural preservation, peace and security, GDP, jobs, service exports, and I think it comes back to the point I made earlier that if you measure tourism, if you measure the spend, if you measure what's going on, then it really is a very significant industry. Tourism employment is probably one of the key reasons why destinations develop tourism. If you had to come up with the number one rationale behind developing a place for tourism, it would be that it creates jobs. So if you look at tourism development plans, that's always the number one rationale for a country deciding to put money and investment into tourism, because ultimately it creates employment, and we know employment is one of the ways out of poverty. The industry is labour intensive, very much so, despite technological change and lots of things, different things we see in the workplace, tourism still needs lots of people. So if you've got a big resort, if you've got a popular destination, there'll be a lot of people working there, maybe seasonal, but the population in terms of workers might double in that peak period. So it is a really labour intensive industry. This statistic, I would say, treat with caution. It changes year on year, but roughly one in 10, 1 in 11 jobs, it's estimated, are part of the tourism sector. So tourism employment is really the number one reason why a destination will bother going to the trouble of, and the significant impacts of tourism, because it's an income generator and a generator of jobs. Just to say, when we think about tourism employment, there's the formal sector, which is the kind of things you would think of if somebody said, well, who works in tourism? You might think of people who work in a hotel, or people who work for an airline, or a tour guide, or chambermaid, quite obvious jobs in tourism that you know yourself as you travel. You come up against people, and it's fairly obvious that they're working in the tourism sector. And these are obviously the people that get measured. So these are those 1 in 10 jobs, because they're a visible workforce. But I've put this slide just to remind you that there's a whole bunch of people who don't figure on the tourism employment statistics. And these are all the people who make a living from tourism, but they are not part of that formal sector. So any disaster management response is not only looking at the livelihoods of those people who are officially employed in tourism, it's looking at the livelihoods of the people who absolutely rely 100% on their being visitors to enable them to make a living. And they do not feature on the tourism statistics. They're the sort of forgotten undercurrent of 80% of the tourism industry. Extremely important, but don't figure on the stats. So remember, there's that unofficial workforce. Now, economic impact of travel and tourism, and I really struggled with this, because when Richard said to me, can you just let me know about the economic impacts? I said, well, yes, I can. I said, but A, I'm not an economist, and B, this is a 10-week course looking at the economic impacts of tourism. So what I dug out was, again from World Travel and Tourism Council, was a slide that I think, if this is something that interests you, this is a really good starting point. So they talk about the direct contribution of tourism through commodities, industries and spend. And then they talk about indirect, induced and total value going through the economy for tourism. Now, I think that's in a nutshell, a really good way of thinking about it. If you're an economist, if you like that kind of thing, there's a mountain of information around direct spend, induced expend and what it comes out to in the end. So that's why I've put that slide on there. But I think for your purposes, you don't really need to know the detail. And then I found this because I thought actually that says it in a bit more of a user-friendly way. For me, as a non-economist, I just think about the tourist dollar. You know, I think someone that comes to a destination, they spend money. Obviously, what process does that trigger? So it triggers money being spent at the point it's spent and how it gets recycled through the economy. So this is actually an example from St Lucia, and it was part of a campaign to make people understand or start thinking about the importance of tourism in the economy. And I like it because it's, like me, it's quite simple. Spend a bit of money, yes, I can see it because I get it. And I think that when there's a problem in the tourism supply, when tourism gets cut off due to a disaster, it's really significant for a whole chain of people who rely on it. So that's why I put that slide up there. So how would I summarise that? Tourism is extremely important economically. If tourism economics is your thing, I can direct you to lots of sources. It affects a lot of people because of its economic value. Tourism is really important for jobs, both those that we can see and that undercurrent of the labour pool that we can't. So what I'm hoping to be building up is a picture of an industry that's growing, an industry that's important, an industry that provides income for people, and an industry that provides jobs for people. So when something happens to that tourism supply, it is a major problem for people in that destination. What is less known, I guess, is how quickly tourism recovers. And if you think of any of the destinations that have had some shock where tourism has, pretty much stopped, as soon as things get back to normal, tourism recovers really quickly. People have a very short memory. So when people say, well, nobody will ever go to Egypt again after the bombings, well, they did actually. 3 months later, those people come back. So it seems that where tourism is significant, it doesn't take very long for it to reach actually similar levels than it was before. So it's one of those industries that has resilience built in. Nobody really understands why, other than people have short memories and people will go for a deal. So it only takes a destination to be cheaper and people will go and tourism comes back up again. That's not to say it isn't significant, but if you were to monitor trends over time, pretty much 3 months after a disaster, if things are running again, tourists will go back. So they're the first to disappear and the first to reappear following any crisis or disaster. So we understand then that tourism is big, very fragmented. What's driving it? Now, in a nutshell, a whole series of factors that mean tourism year on year as being able to sustain levels of sort of 3% growth. It's called travel propensity, if you're looking at it from a tourism perspective, and if you're a tourism student, the propensity of a country's population. So what it's saying is travel propensity is the likelihood or the ability that someone would be able to travel. And if you think about it, it's quite logical, and the most important factor is income levels. So as people get wealthier, that destination, that country, its propensity goes up. So as soon as people are a little bit wealthier, perhaps they are able to join this group of people who travel. You can see that alone is why there's strong growth and strong demand. And I'm saying, come back to China again, where there's a lot of people having small incremental growths in income, and then there's a big middle class developing in China. They are fueling the growth from China. And that's exactly the same as it was in the UK and Spain and Germany in the 1970s. It's the countries that are growing now. And everyone's looking at Brazil and India as being the next propensity for tourism because of those income levels. Greater urbanisation sounds obvious, but you've got to be able to travel if you're going to partake in travel, and it's much more easy to do that if you're living in a city or a town. So remote rural areas will not have the same ability for people to travel as obviously those in urban centres. Higher education attainment's a really interesting one because there's evidence to suggest that as people become more educated, that drives tourism growth. I suspect it's because it's related to income. I doubt as a variable on its own it would carry any weight, but it's there and it's obvious because of the income I get. Smaller family size, and that's, if you think about it practically, if you've got 10 children, it's quite difficult to take them anywhere. If you've got 2, it's still quite difficult, but it's more likely. But again, it's related to income because we know that the wealthier a population gets, the wealthier a family becomes, it has fewer children. So it's all part of that demographic. This one is really significant, greater holiday entitlement. And if you look at when travel and tourism really took off, it was after the Second World War, when the United Nations finally agreed that people who were in work were entitled to paid holiday. So if suddenly people had the freedom to travel even if they got a job. So that was really, really significant. So when you look at a country, one of the things I always say to students is, well, how much annual leave does that country get as a minimum requirement? What is it for the UK? What's the minimum?
4 weeks?
Yeah, it is. It's 4 weeks. It's 20 days. So if you've got a job, legally, you have to be given 20 days paid leave. Do you know what it is in the US?
Oh, it's pathetic.
It is pathetic. It's actually 14.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't actually give people 3 weeks. So, if you think about how that might affect travel, it does, because you haven't got the time. I think the country, and I always ask the students this because they're always a multinational group, and we think France has got the highest. It's about 35 days a year.
I think Yusuf said, like 60, I think.
In a man?
Yeah. Yeah.
I get 60.
60?
Yeah.
I guess we all have to move to a man then. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge variation, but really, really important for people's ability to travel. Spread of car ownership, if you think back a few slides, domestic tourism, people travelling by car, as more and more people have availability to vehicles, then again that fuels domestic tourism growth. So these are really sort of drivers for change. If I just scoot through the bigger picture ones, then the first one quite obviously is level of economic development, and if you were to look at tourism demand, where people travel from and to, most of the tourism activity of course comes from the developed and the developing nations, and it's simply to do with wealth. So the higher the GDP or of a GNP of a country, the more likely its inhabitants are to be able to travel. Second one is political factors, and this might be significant for you as disaster management perspective. Politics affects our ability to travel, and it's something that we often don't really think about, but it's in terms of safety and security, political stability, interventions, and this one is really crucial, controls on visas and passports.
Yeah. Doesn't use the now.
Yes, I'm sure. And and a lot of my students, roll their eyes when they say this because of the difficulties they've had just to get into the UK to study. So this is absolutely significant. If you want to enable people to travel, then you have to enable people to get passports and visas.
Yes.
And that's a minefield. It's a very good way of controlling what people do. Well, a final one, external factors. And if you think about these things, they're all things that are likely to enable people in a country to be able to travel as opposed to not. But the detail, I guess, is less important, but it's related to income, it's related to the country's level of development, and then it's really obvious things like accessibility and transport, because to be able to travel, there's got to be a decent transport system. And I think I'm guilty of this being somebody who teaches tourism, that you sort of think everybody travels, and actually there's 2/3 of the world that don't, and they don't because of poverty and they don't because of infrastructure. But if you imagine a world in 100 years' time when that's changed, the propensity for travel globally is astonishing. In fact, I doubt we'll move or find a place to stay. But it is significant. So in terms of drivers for growth, then I think they're the key ones that you should be aware of. Now, drivers for risk. 10 important world tourism issues for 2019, and I put these slide up so that you've got them. You've got a record for what they are. And I've put these two because I think these are I guess more relevant for your purposes. So concerns for safety and security remain an important issue for the travel and tourism industry. Absolutely. You know, it's really one of those things that's come to the forefront in the last 5 years. People are increasingly concerned about safety and security. And then there's the issues around impacts of tourism on climate change and global warming and the consequent problems that might bring to a destination, because there's no direct relationships, it's difficult to prove. But think of the disasters that happen that could be related to climate change. So there's the top 5. There's another one on the number 7. Effect on travel and tourism from natural, human-induced disasters, health issues and political disruptions. And I suppose what these slides do is to show where the tourism industry realises there's an issue and where there are concerns. And I suspect we'll see these creeping up the agenda as people think more about the issues that tourism has got to face. So that's why I've given you those 2 slides, so you can see that 3 of them actually bear direct relationship to disasters, both natural and man-made. Now, I'm not going to spend very long on these because I know from your schedule you've got people coming in specifically to talk to you about these different things. But if we're looking at drivers for risk, one of them is air transport. And it's really to say that much like tourism, the growth of it shows no sign of slowing down. So it's a very the potential for increases in air transport are enormous, despite all of the problems and the environmental problems and all of the negative arguments we hear. As yet, there's no alternative. So no one can really see that the aviation industry will not continue to grow. It might cost more, but it will continue to grow. So I just wanted to give you the point that air transport is growing. So it's as a driver for risk, because there's a lot of risk associated with this sector, it's one where we will continue to see strong growth. The other one, which is probably more recent, and again you'll get a lot of detail on this over the course of the week, is the cruise industry. And cruise tourism, of course, has a really peculiar set of its own factors that make it one of the areas that is prone to risk in a way that other aspects are, because effectively it's a floating destination. So you've got all of those things happening in the destination. Oh, and just to add for fun, put it on the sea. So you can imagine if there's a problem, how difficult it is to manage things that may concern within cruise tourism. Won't say any more other than it's a massive growth area, and I think has taken the tourism industry by surprise a little bit. And we knew it was coming, and everyone said yes, cruise is becoming more popular. But I don't think anyone really thought how popular. They didn't think other markets would buy into it in quite the way that they have. So pretty much anyone now goes on a cruise. Whereas 10 years ago, it was elderly people with lots of money. You know, and it's so diverse now that it's really fueling growth in a phenomenal stage. Because what else is happening is the ships are getting bigger. So whereas you might in the past have been looking at 1,000 people or 1,500, now you might be looking at 5,000. So a really monstrous growth industry, if I can call it that. So really the third one that I'll just say a little bit more on is the type of tourist. So there's the obvious risks come from growth in the air transport industry, growth in the cruise sector, but there's changes in the way people are travelling and the way people are behaving. Now, again, to bring this back to postgraduate level, a little bit of theory. there's a lot of obsession with trying to classify tourists. If you're in the tourism industry, if you're in tourism academia, you spend all the time obsessing about how we classify these types of travellers. And the one I'll introduce you to is a guy called Stanley Plogg. He wrote this in 1974. And Plogg was one of the first people that tried to categorise tourists by their type. And he came up with really unmanageable, unfriendly words of psychocentric type, which essentially means conservative, safe mass tourism, and the allocentric type, which he said are the adventurous, independent, wanderer type of tourist. Terrible words to remember. What's slightly easier to remember is Plogg's bell curve, and essentially he said that most of us fall somewhere in the middle. So these are our allocentric risk takers. These are the independent travellers who are not frightened of everything. In fact, seek out destinations that they'll be alone, they'll be independent. And then these over here are mass tourists that even want to take their own food with them, because they don't want anything that's slightly alien or different from their usual environment. And then most of us fall somewhere within the middle. Now, he was writing in the 1970s, and what I think is really interesting is when Plogg wrote this, absolutely everybody was heading in this direction. We were heading towards the mass tourists, the people that wanted looking after from the day they booked their travel to the day they got home. So they go to safe destinations, travel in groups, places that are familiar to them. And he was saying that we were heading in this direction, which of course we were. But recently, and when I say recently, I reckon since we're now looking at about 2010, so in the last 8 years, we're seeing things shifting a little bit more to this more adventurous type of tourism. Nobody really knows why, other than people of a certain generation who've been fortunate enough to be travelling for the last 20 years are looking for something new. So they're experienced travellers. They tend to be in their early 50s up to the mid-60s in age, so they're relatively senior. They've got money, they've done everything, they're looking for a bit of excitement, effectively. So they are driving some of the risk behind more risky tourism behaviour. And I've got a handout which I'll give you, and I think one of the things that I would pick on if I was to say about how risk is becoming more dominant is through adventure tourism or extreme tourism. So adventure tourism is not quite as risky, but it's travel that it involves some element of thrill seeking. And the people doing this are not young. So we always think, oh, it's younger people doing this, and it's not. Actually, statistics are it's people in their 50s and 60s. So there's a massive growth in adventure tourism. And it's really about people doing things to challenge themselves and experience some kind of excitement. Growth accompanied by increased commercialisation of all the paraphernalia that you need to engage in this type of activity. It's a whole industry surrounding enabling people to go mountain climbing and kayaking. And you've only got to go to the beach in the summer to see all of this going on. It's quite phenomenal. So adventure tourism is proving quite challenging because it's opening people up to risk in ways that they hadn't really thought of before. Now, there's physical risk obviously associated with these activities, but I guess from your perspective, what's as important is it's taking people into more remote areas. So if you think of a disaster occurring on a mountainside, it's that sort of less accessible area where you used to be fairly confident there was nobody. Now the chances are there's probably a group of tourists. So it's taking people into more remote destinations and zones that are more problematic to get people out of if there's an issue. That's reproduced terribly, but a model of risk factors, and this is just in relation to adventure tourism. And in your own time, just have a look at that and think about some of the implications of actually trying to look at and monitor risk in relation to this more adventurous type of tourism that we're seeing. And I'll leave you with just a final thought on this slide, last couple of slides to go, is who's responsible for it. And I know Richard I caught him talking to you about that when I came in at the end. The problem is who's responsible for it. If we've got all these drivers for risk, we've got more risky things going on, we've got growth in tourism, who's actually monitoring the well-being of tourists at those destinations? And the answer is lots of people. Is it coordinated? Well, what do you think? No. So huge problems with the different interests, and because most people are looking after their own interests first. Last few slides, and Richard specifically asked me to mention to you the United Nations World Tourism Organization. They've been around a long time. They are really the only body that has an overview globally of the tourism industry. And they're the one that, if you're looking for international comparison, if you use UN WTO figures, they are directly comparable. And most governments and most agencies buy into the UN WTO way of doing things, and it gives some standardisation across the industry. They're actually really responsible for the promotion of responsible, sustainable and universally accessible tourism. Now, originally, UN WTO was more preoccupied, I guess, with economic factors of tourism, but they've really begun to realise actually what's more important is sustainability and tourism being managed in the longer term. So their focus has shifted over time. And we, as an institution, have dealings with the UNWTO because one of their remits is education. So we're a centre of excellence for the UNWTO because we and have courses accredited by them as part of that tourism education and capacity building. So for an academic, UNWTO is important as the same for the industry. What is, I think, really worth you spending some time is just to go to UNWTO's website and have a look at what they're doing in terms of tourism resilience. And I'm thinking this will come back again throughout the course of this week. UNWTO, through the Programme of Sustainable Development of Tourism, so when you go to the website, it'll say lots of things on the top. One of the things it says is programmes. If you go to programmes, this is where you find stuff about resilience of tourism development. To develop, plan and implement crisis management systems that will reduce the impact of recovery from crisis, partly through the provision of the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism. So I would say if you don't take very much away from this lecture, go and have a look at this website, because I think that's really crucial to what's coming next as part of this CPD that you're looking at. So the point is they have a programme around resilience of tourism development, and it's quite new, and it's spun out of their sustainability arm, which has been going for 20 years. This, I think, has only been going for about 5. It's much newer. So do take a look at that. And there is, when you get these slides, just follow the link to it. It should take you straight there. Cruise lines, IATA, events organisers, and if you're interested in following up any of the academic side, Page and Connell, Tourism and Modern Synthesis. But any tourism textbook will give you a really good overview, a massive overview of the tourism industry.